Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
All right, welcome to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I am Joshua Mobley, and I am very pleased to be joined today by our own author, John McCabe. John has written an incredible new book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Last 8 Days, and a rich and detailed account of the final days of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life. It's a fascinating journey as he travels towards his end, and John has done a remarkable job of collecting this into a readable book that is simultaneously readable, but then also thorough and of use to historians and interested lay people alike. We're very happy to have John with us. John is a research associate at the Von Hugel Institute at Cambridge University, and we're very happy to have him. He joins us here from his home there in England, and we are thankful to have you today. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to be with you and to be doing this together.
Yeah, well, we're so happy to have you. John has been a privilege to work with over the last several months as we have been, from my perspective, as I've started to engage with him more over the last several months on the sales and marketing side of his book, and he's been a joy to work with. So let's just dive in. John, we have this book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, on the last 8 days of his life. And, so a character like Bonhoeffer, a lot has been written about him. And I wonder, what is it about your book that is unique? Why did you feel like we needed this particular account of Bonhoeffer's final days?
Well, yes, Josh. Well, thanks for asking that. From when I first started reading about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I was always curious as to how things came together in the final part of his life. And as I read more and more biographies about that last week, I just had a growing feeling there's a bit more to be done. So I noticed that there was quite a lot of accounts sort of repeating names and repeating the same details, just with slightly changed wording so as not to quote other authors. So I felt moved, really, and motivated to dig more deeply, to look for other first-hand sources and to do a more rounded account and not let it to be through one dominant narrative voice, which had been the case up to when I put the project together. So I wanted to find out myself, but also I thought maybe if I do that, then I can turn that into something.
Yeah, well, we're all very thankful that you did. And I noticed, in the preface to your book here, you have a really moving story kind of setting the stage for your own interest in it and some of the kind of material artifacts that you have that sparked your interest. So I wonder if you could kind of tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, my stepfather gave me a copy of Mein Kampf, which he'd been sort of literally thrown when he was in Canadian intelligence at the end of World War II.
Wow.
And that's kind of a bit of an old book from the time that played a role in my interest in the period. And I was thinking about the actual books that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had used during that last week. So I went out and I tried to purchase, and I was successful in getting copies of the Losungen, and I haven't quite managed to get hold of a 1911 edition of a Stuttgart Luther Bible yet, but that kind of sparked me towards getting original old texts. And so I went right back to the sources. I got hold of a number of them, Lies and Plutarch and so on. And so I wanted to kind of get into the world that Bonhoeffer was inhabiting during his last very kind of uncomfortable traveling week together.
Yeah. And so, speaking of going back to the sources and the source material, you are engaging a lot of material in this book, and some of which has not really been engaged with in the English language. So could you take us into some of the unique sources that you're diving into here?
Yes, okay. Well, why don't we start with the Losungen? That was, if you like, the daily Bible reading notes that Bonhoeffer used. They're called in English the Moravian Daily Texts. And it turns out that they are worldwide the kind of longest continuously published source of daily Bible notes. And there's a couple of lovely stories about those that Bonhoeffer was using. So I wanted to investigate those, to learn what they were, to read them day by day as Bonhoeffer was reading them, so that I could journey with him throughout that final week. So I managed to get the 1945 edition into my hand. I've bought a Swiss one from 1945, which is not quite a German one, but it's 99% the same. And that was one example of getting close to the reading life that he was able to do in his sort of cramped last week together. That was just one, but obviously there were quite a few more that fell into that category.
You're talking about his daily reading that he's doing, and you're following him in this book on a daily time frame. So we're talking through these last 8 days. So there is this very kind of rhythmic, almost liturgical kind of feel to the book that you've produced here and to his last days. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what were those rhythms for him that carried him through these last 8 days?
Well, elsewhere in his writing, Bonhoeffer talks about allowing the stillness of the eternal to come around you on a daily basis. And so we know from his rule of life that was very important. So I felt, for him in these travelling days, because it was a very cramped bus and conditions were terrible. So I don't know when one could get a bit of time for silence. In the overnight things, when it was literally so jam-packed full and people were lying unconscious, sort of having passed out from the fumes in the police van, it just must have been very very trying. But I think if you're a person who understands having an inner life and the ability to connect with God in any and every situation, then that's what he would have reached for in those days. So I think knowing how he functioned and knowing what was important to him, he had cultivated his own inner life in many months in prison, and this was kind of a different incarceration situation. So I feel that he knowing that he had these books with him and having his Bible and his Losung and the daily texts, I feel I was able to get a bit closer to how he was able to tough through some of those difficult days.
Yeah, absolutely. And you recently traveled to Germany, correct?
That is correct, yes. We did the last 8 days tour. So
that's great.
So the point of the tour was actually that we would follow those daily readings and we'd go to the places that Bonhoeffer went to, and that we would do our pilgrimage journey together in those places in Germany 80 years on. So if you like to follow in the footsteps, to honour and mark the days. Yeah, I wanted to see, for example, we went to so many wonderful places, Bonhoeffer's birthplace included, but connecting with what I've already mentioned about his daily readings, I hadn't up until this point been to Herrnhut, which is the worldwide centre of the Moravian Brethren Church and daily readings. Right. And so I actually sort of held in my hand the 1945 text, which was the right edition for the time, and I saw how they choose out from little tiny squares the actual daily readings at the bowl they take them out of, and the room where they choose those 3 years in advance. And so it was really special. It was a great connection with Bonhoeffer, because his system with his illegal ordinands was that he kind of said, if everything else fails and we're not allowed to distribute letters, and everything, which in the end they weren't, then we know that as a kind of community of believers, we will, as a last resort, all be reading the Losungen together. And the other lovely thing about that is that by a curious happenstance, the Losungen in those years were printed on special paper, flown in by the special behest of the Nazi regime. because of a happenstance coincidence of somebody who intervened to get them still printed. So there was such a paper shortage in Germany. It was like a kind of a curious miracle that the Losung existed at all.
Wow.
So it was quite special to go to Herrnhut, and then we went down and stayed in Hof, which is where Bonhoeffer was transported through. And I was invited to celebrate communion in the Lutheran church there by the pastor who I happened to meet the night before by a little bit of good fortune. And that was very moving. And then she said a pilgrimage blessing on our entire pilgrimage group. And then we went on from there. We actually went through the winding roads that Bonhoeffer took, crossed the Danube by, again, another quite sort of almost sort of surreal set of accidental circumstances, across the right bridge, because the other road was closed that happened to lead us there, the Maximilian Bridge in Deggendorf. And as we crossed the Deggendorf, we started climbing into the Bavarian forest, and we were able to imagine the feeling in the group as they, for the first time, were able to look out of the window, because they by then had a new bus, because we'd done all the Regensburg prison and everything, and we went on our way to Schönberg. And so our emotions were able to be in connection with some of those of the group that Bonhoeffer was travelling with in those final days. So it was really all quite remarkable. And then the welcome we received in Schönberg was wonderful. So and then we retraced Bonhoeffer's steps from Schönberg after we kind of did a remembering moment about his final service there. We then did retrace the route that he was driven that same day, the Sunday, the 8th of April, 1945, along those same roads, really, that he was taken along on his way to a kind of rigged trial and then execution.
Now, I mean, that's a really touching experience, and it causes me to think, this is not necessarily relevant to when this podcast will release, but it is currently Maundy Thursday right now, and we're in the lead up to Easter. Good Friday is tomorrow, and what you're describing sounds so much like, the Via Dolorosa or the Stations of the Cross, or one of these kinds of journeys where you follow along behind the crucified one. And I wonder, thinking about Bonhoeffer's own end in maybe analogous ways, and from a biographical perspective, did Bonhoeffer think of his own death as a martyrdom? And if so, was he prepared for that?
Well, those are you give me so many questions there, Josh. They're all great ones. So let's just start with Maundy Thursday. So thank you for introducing the fact that today is Maundy Thursday. So I was reminded this week that 50% of the Gospel of John is about the last week of Jesus' life. And 1/3 of the other synoptic Gospels are about the last week of Jesus' life. And so this is the day when we should slow down, right? This is the time in the Christian life when we should slow down. So many Christians are very keen to sort of jump over the difficulty of the cross and say, yes, well, on Sunday, by the time we get to Sunday, everything's fine because it's all back to normal and it's Easter Day. So I think that the slowing down aspect, it's a good nudge for us to say, okay, the mystery of why Jesus died is there. So it seems really kind of inappropriate to link Bonhoeffer's journey with Jesus's journey, because in one sense it's not. Bonhoeffer was just a Lutheran pastor and a Christian, but it just felt really curious to me to notice that there were 13 people in the room of his last service, and that actually he was driven to a rigged trial and then executed in the most gruesome way possible known to humankind. And so those are similarities with the Easter story, which it was very moving to sort of remember that journey. And part two was Bonhoeffer thinking of martyrdom. I think absolutely not. He was an ordinary Christian who stood up for what he felt was right and the truth, and that would have been the furthest thing from his mind. So I think he did believe that he had a good chance of getting a fair trial, although he was very realistic.
Wow.
He knew that the worst of the system might well conspire against him.
Yes, which is indeed what ended up happening. So in the kind of lead up there, then he is expecting that, well, as you say, he has a realistic expectation that it may go south, but he still thinks that there's a possibility that he will come through this. Is that right?
Well, I think that's the point of slowing down in the final week. And I want to give readers, viewers and listeners the opportunity to stay with some of the difficulty and pain of that final week. And for example, if we look at his cell companion, Rabenau, we have a testimony that actually he believed he was going to get a fair trial. So he kind of insisted after Bonhoeffer was taken away on being taken to Flossenberg, where he was told, which was such an untruth, that there was a functioning branch of the People's Court. And actually it was very moving, because at Flossenberg, on Wednesday, I sort of went up in the cafe to someone sitting there on their own, and I just greeted him, and he just turned to me and he told me his name, and he said it was Rabenau. And so that's, I was then met two the nearest relatives of Rabenau's family, and so I was able to hand them over the first off-press edition, the German translation edition of my book, and inscribe it for them, and actually. I was very, very moved to make that presentation, and so I think Bonhoeffer believed in a good Germany, as did Rabenau. I think he believed in the German legal system, although he knew it was infiltrated. So he was realistic, but I think he'd a couple of times given strong indications that he knew that his own efforts might cost him his life. So that was an example of his bravery and courage, where he continued to persist.
Right. So you say he still has this kind of faith in the German legal system, at least in principle. And I wonder, what were his political convictions like at this stage, and did they change over time as he's moving through, as things change in Germany, as the Nazi Party develops? So could you take us into his kind of political convictions that in many ways bring him to this position?
Yeah, I think he starts off as an everyday believer with a very theologically informed mind, and then he becomes the person who writes a lot, and then is very involved in politics and resistance. So, we see him sort of in 1933, 34, taking an active stand against the actions of the regime, and then, writing quite far-reaching communications that suggest that you need to put your life on the line to resist things that are happening in his own Germany. And then, 34, 35, he's kind of taken out of that, because he takes himself out of it by going to his time in England. But I think that even there, he was going around saying this regime must be resisted. And so we see, if you like, the tempo going up of his determination to resist and to be active at a political level, stepping up through his life in a kind of measured and traceable way. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of a little bit more of the same. It's kind of quite scripturally informed, and I think he's a believer who wants faith and action to be linked. And so in that sense, he's not really political. He doesn't want to be, but he has to be, because the Christian faith is quite political, because Jesus calls people to a life of discipleship, and that discipleship affects every area of our lives. And so we are called to be people who take action when action needs to be taken.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's just a wonderful kind of account of what Bonhoeffer's life should inspire us toward today, is a similar kind of unity of faith and the action that we take in the world. I know that there's been a significant amount of interest in your book, particularly in Germany. And so could you tell us, what is the ongoing significance of Bonhoeffer's life in a German context? And then as a follow-up to that, what is the ongoing significance of his life in a Anglophone context? So in the UK and in America, Canada, those places in particular.
Bonhoeffer's standing in Germany is he's a bit of a national treasure. And so if I can give a bit more background to that, 1944, when he was in the very worst of all prisons, which was the Gestapo interrogation dungeon in Prince Albrechtstrasse, he wrote what ended up being his final communication really to his family and particularly his fiancée Maria. And it's a German poem called Von Guten Mächten. And I think he's really writing about angels and God's presence. So he's wrestling with God's presence in the present moment and in the darkest of places. And he finds, curiously, he finds that God is with him, and he writes about his wish and hope, and obviously prayer, that they may see one another again, that actually they may see the sunshine again, and that hope will hold them. And so even if the bitter cup of suffering is what comes from God, he trusts that what comes will be from God. He prays that he will be able to take it because it's from God's good and loving hand. And so to have that kind of relationship with God in that sort of darkest of hours and darkest of places, he writes this poem Von Guten Mächten. And in Germany, it's been translated into, and there's a lovely lyric that goes with it. So I won't try and sing it, Josh, but...
come on.
No, that's coming later. But Von Guten Mächten is a bit like, it's kind of a bit like a national anthem that you would sing at every funeral. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so Von Guten Mächten means of good powers, but that's useless when you translate that literally into English. So it means that whatever happens, God is with us and God holds us and there is hope for the future. And so that's become a very important part of German life and understanding. So that's just one example of the way Bonhoeffer's name is known. People would sometimes sing it at a funeral and they wouldn't know it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who wrote it, and they wouldn't know under what terrible circumstances. But his theology, obviously all written in German, has continued to inspire a generation of ordinary Christian people who want to be disciples, as well as a lot of scholarship, as well as a lot of kind of Christian faithfulness, really. So I think in the German context, his name and life story are well known, and I'm quite fond of saying, the proper currency of theology is biography. So what I mean by that is, as Christians, we don't learn so much from these fantastic scholars and from scholarly concepts, but we learn from life stories of real people. And so this is someone whose name and story has been just of lasting and tremendous encouragement to just millions, really, of Christian faithful disciples and believers in Germany. So his legacy has changed over time, because he was regarded as a traitor for the first 40 years, and then it's only gradually that we've got to where we are today. And even in former East Germany, when we did this trip recently, we popped over to Poland, to his birthplace, which is called Breslau in German, but actually now it's called Wrocław in Poland. And when we then, because we'd gone over there and we had to find our way back, we went to Dresden, and there we found that was in former East Germany. I sort of saw, when I went to the because of the book, because this was the tour that goes with the book, The Last 8 Days, we went to the Klemperer house up in that part of Dresden where the Klemperers used to live before the firestorm bombings. And so we went there, but I started seeing streets like Bordelschwing Street, and then I saw the driver took me, within literally 90-second or 2-minute taxi drive of the Klemperer house to a Bonhoeffer Platz, a Bonhoeffer Square. And so what came out of that was that my taxi driver, who is this source of wonderful information, I don't mind disclosing its source, he sparked me towards a conversation where I realised and had confirmed that actually the legacy of Bonhoeffer in former East Germany was very strong, because given the fact that it was completely owned and dominated by the Russians, then all the Germans who lived in East Germany were kind of, well, can we talk about this? Can we not talk about it? So they had him kind of on a list of resistors who'd resisted fascism. And so because for East Germans, Bonhoeffer was added to the acceptable list of people who'd resisted fascism, they were allowed to have in Dresden a Bonhoeffer Square. So his name was allowed to be known. So there was quite a few more people in those 40, early 50 years who were receptive to the name Bonhoeffer and his writings and his story from the former East Germany. And so it's almost like he was unknown in West Germany and really well known in East Germany. But now the two have joined together now. Yeah. I would say as a whole, Bonhoeffer's name is really very well known to a good number of Germans now, in as much as a kind of theologian and thinker can be well known. But I think from then on, little by little, the number of faithful Bonhoeffer scholars and disciples and students and Christian believers, people who find their faith is encouraged by studying Bonhoeffer's writings and by following his story and learning more of it, has gradually grown and grown in the UK. And so that also is, I think, true in what you call the Anglophone context.
Well, sure. I mean, I think, one of the reasons why we're so interested in your book is that Bonhoeffer continues to be well talked about here in the U.S. in particular. And his legacy is often quite complicated. So he is taken up politically, sometimes on the right, sometimes on the left. And so it seems like in some ways the legacy of Bonhoeffer is still somewhat contested here in the U.S. It may be that it isn't fully decided where his legacy lies. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm personally so interested in your book and its reception here in America in particular, because I think your book has an awful lot to offer on as to what Bonhoeffer was really about and the kinds of things that Bonhoeffer was attempting to accomplish. And I wonder if, kind of as a closing question here, you might indicate for us what are some of the, there are some long-standing kind of myths about Bonhoeffer's last days, and some of them are quite benign, others maybe not so much. I wonder if you could comment on some of those myths and some of the ways that your book hopes to kind of correct the record, so to speak.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, I mean, I think one of the principal ones is this myth about the camp doctor saying that I've never seen a man, die like this. He knelt and everything, and it was all very dignified. And that was kind of nixed in about, I think, 1988 by a Danish author. But sadly, myths get repeated and repeated and repeated. So it's still being repeated to this day that this business of him kneeling to pray happened. And I'm sure it didn't. And I'm sure that the person who delivered and created the myth, felt that it helped his own position to create it. So I think his death is a lot starker when we strip out things like that. It's a lot less rose-tinted if we can actually bear to connect with just how dark it was and how terrible it was, and what a dreadful combination of human things conspired together to enable it to happen in the protracted way in which it did. So I think that's, at one level, that's kind of part of stripping away from some of the rose-tinted myth-making. There's a few smaller practical ones about, where the Grünemünde bus police van stopped and where it didn't, and who got out and who got in where or not. Those are some of the kind of points of detail that help you, if you like. If you're trying to create an accurate picture of someone, if you start with the small details, then you build from them, I think, to the bigger picture. Here's one more. The British agent, whose name was Hugh Falconer, whose agent number was 007, and I'm not joking when I say that.
It's amazing.
Yes, his kind of cover identity was that he was a downed RAF pilot. Now, he was also a downed RAF. Well, he was an RAF pilot before he joined, to be an undercover agent. But when he got captured, that's what he was doing in the war. And he was one of our most successful agents working against the enemy of the entire war. And so when he, when when the Germans were driving the bus to get the captives to the place they wanted to get them to, at one point, it's sort of this fairly rudimentary vehicle stops, and the driver kind of becomes too intimate with the prisoners and says, "Can anyone help me get this thing going?" And so it's fantastic because he says, "Well, I'm an engineer." And so while the driver is going around getting some oil, which would be terrible news because with a bit of oil it might keep going, he scoops up a bit of grit and he puts grit into the engine, and then when he's given this spanner to tighten it all up because he's taken the cap off, he tightens the cap up again, and the thing runs for about another 200 yards, and then it's stopped forever because he's put sand in the machinery. And actually, I really enjoy that story because I know that Bonhoeffer was working for someone called Oster, and I know that in his resistance to the Germans, to the German regime, which he was also working for, his favourite kind of trope was, "This is more sand in the Nazi machinery." And so, there's a little bit of a connected Bonhoeffer story with that undercover bit of activity there. But, I think it's genuinely true that act nearly saved Bonhoeffer's life. Because if he could have just derailed the hostage, convoy process just a little bit more, then, he could have actually saved Bonhoeffer's life. And I think that's quite poignant.
Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting, the kind of corrections that you're offering on one hand, you have these dramatic moments where they're dropping sand into the engine to delay things. And if it had only been, another couple hours, maybe something, But then on the other hand, the actual death itself, as you said, was much more stark and austere, and it was much less kind of spiritually heroic looking from the outside. There's maybe less there that you would want to sort of paint a picture of a man kneeling to pray right before, So there's in some sense, there's a less of that, almost maybe kind of sentimental drama. But there is actually a good bit of just the real life drama of his own life coming to an end. And I think, as you say, it brings us to a really remarkable place, that this man who endured a lot that wasn't pretty, and it wasn't in any way something that we would want to look back on nostalgically as some of the myths do. But yet it is still remarkable and heroic, and something that we can learn an enormous amount from. So, John, thank you so much for your work in this book. I know this has been a multi-year labor of love for you to get this produced, and we here at Baylor University Press are honored to have played a part in that, and we look forward to continue working together. So if you're listening today and you are intrigued, which I assume that you are, you can purchase the book today at BaylorPress.com. John McCabe, his newest book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Last 8 Days, is out now with Baylor University Press. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.